The Pullman Strike of 1894 and its effects on the white population by Khalil Parsons. My thesis for this project is that the Pullman Strike of 1894 affected the white population in both a negative and positive way. Welcome to historic Pullman. This is a town full of history and is still standing from the 1800s. This town was created by a man named George M. Pullman. George M. Pullman was the owner of the Pullman Sleeping Car Company. George Pullman was born on March 2, 1831, in Brockton, New York. He moved to Chicago as a young engineer. He started a railroad company in 1867. By 1890, he had absorbed over 6 other companies and made them into Pullman companies. His company was very successful because, unlike much other businesses, he had sleeping cars. It was like a hotel on wheels. The Pullman Company was one of the most prominent companies in not only Illinois, but also in the United States at that time. By 1880, he had hired up to 5,500 workers. The town of Pullman was created by him for his workers. It was a fully operating town with churches, parks, schools, and banks. The workers were required to work there if they wanted to be a Pullman porter. For many opportunists, such as African Americans who had just recently gotten out of slavery, it was the ideal job that also provided a home. This is how Pullman attracted so many workers from all over the place. The catch was that the rent was extremely high and some of the houses were poorly built. Pullman made this town so he could control his workers not only at work, but at home too. What was said was low pay and high rent. To be a Pullman porter was to be a man who worked for the Pullman Porter Company. The jobs were very all around. Some of the jobs were working on the cars and accommodating the customers' every needs. Another job was controlling the train from a station located by the clock tower. More jobs included cleaning the stables, building the cars, etc. Working conditions for a Pullman porter were good, but they were overworked. A Pullman porter usually worked about 400 hours a month and only got paid $100. They were required to be available at all times. In 1893, there was a financial crisis in Chicago. This is when the Pullman porters decided to join the American Railway Union, which was led by a man named Eugene Debs. During this crisis, 4,000 Pullman porters were laid off and wages were reduced by 25% in the Pullman Company. Unions in the Pullman porter community were formed. One night, a council of Pullman porters were discussing the decrease in pay. They brought their grievance to Pullman. Pullman dismissed and fired 3 of the workers. Later that month, the workers heard about this and voted to strike. The strike began on May 11th and lasted for 6 months. Big help during the strike was Eugene Debs. All over the country, he led the railroad workers and told them to boycott Pullman cars. He was the leader of the ARU, or American Railway Union. This affected lots of businesses because if a train had a Pullman car on it, then people all over the country would not work it. The United States Postal Service suffered the most because its main form of transportation in that period of time was by train. That meant people all over the country could not get things delivered or received if a Pullman car was on that train. Another key character in the strike was John P. Altgeld. He was the governor of Illinois. Altgeld sided with the Pullman porters because for 6 months they were suffering. All of the workers striking were without pay and it was very hard to feed their families. Altgeld wrote 3 letters to Pullman. The first letter was to him about the complaints he had gotten from the strikers and how he had heard that their families were starving. He wrote to Pullman about the workers suffering. Pullman did not respond to the letters. Altgeld wrote that he would examine the Pullman neighborhood before he took legal action in the strikers' homes. When he did, he in fact saw families suffering. He wrote again to Pullman about the conditions. Pullman did not respond. In early July, federal troops went into the strike. There were no riots previous to this. When the riots started, 5 buildings were burned down and railway cars were destroyed. For all of the times the federal troops shot into the crowd, 15 people were killed and even more were wounded. All Guild strongly protested this and saw that the workers with suffering families were also getting killed by people he did not even originally want to help. 80% of the people suffering were women and children, who sided with the workers or wanted what was best for them. The strike was disastrous after the federal troops came in. Many buildings were burned down, train cars were destroyed, and many people were killed by the troops. Businesses most affected by the strike were the U.S. Postal Services and companies delivering cargo. All of these companies' business was hindered because if a Pullman car was attached to a train that had their car on it, then people in the ARU would not operate it. The ARU was a successful union during that period of time and got the Pullman strikers' point across the country. Debs was a great person for getting their point to the media and organized protesting. The downfall of the ARU was that it was so successful, Pullman got all of the leaders in jail. Pullman said any person who got people to boycott his company was getting arrested. After the strike, the workers lost and Pullman won. A lot of the workers suffered the after effects of the strike, most in poverty. Personally, I think Pullman could have helped them get out of the rut. The ARU was shut down in 27 states and made the process slower. Pullman died 3 years after the strike at the age of 66 in 1897. He was a successful businessman, but not a very kind one. He controlled all of his workers at all times. It was like he had slaves. He set up his business so that people had to live where he wanted them to and work where he wanted them to. Cars were extremely uncommon at this time, so people were mostly limited to the Pullman area, so they had to shop in the Pullman grocery stores, do banking at the Pullman Bank, and send their kids to the Pullman school. After the strike, the workers lost and Pullman won. A lot of the workers suffered the after effects of the strike, most in poverty. Personally, I think Pullman could have helped them get out of this rut. Even though wages were still low and rent was still high, the porters did win one way. This helped form unions all across the country, especially in African Americans. The reactions to the immediate strike by the whites were not good for the Pullman porters. The public did not like the idea of the strike. There were some audiences who followed Eugene Debs and Alt Guild because they were Democrats. Otherwise, the media and public were astonished and disgusted with the porters. From the outside, it looked like America in a whole was losing business, and it was because of the Pullman porters striking and the ARU. They did not have much support from the public, and this might have helped Pullman win. The strike affected the white population negatively because it would cost more money to ship things by mail, because train at that time was the easiest way to ship things. But the company would have to find other means of transportation, which meant it would be harder for them to do it, and it would cost the whites more money. The whites did not like the strike, mostly in the South, because a lot of the Pullman porters were African American. This is the area where the ARU was mostly banned or shut down. The strikes affected the whites in a positive way because they may have looked at the blacks differently and see them defying a white man. The whites may have seen the blacks as a more powerful force that can work together instead of mindless slaves that are like stray dogs. Assuming that blacks were not exactly wealthy at that time, and some white people still wanted slavery or control over them, they might not have gotten the same service as the whites, like mail. This means that the African Americans were most likely neutral on the situation if they were not supporting it. In the end, the strike helped the workers form unions. It affected the whites in a negative and positive way. The workers suffered because of it. Alt Guild thought the strike to be foolish. I think the strike was brave, and they did deserve higher pay and lower rent and hours. This is the impact of the Chicago Pullman Porter strike, and a lot of its remnants are still standing today.